Hi, I'm Dawn Skorczewski, and this is the first of our Writers at Work series in which we talk about what we do as writers in our fields. I'm the coordinator of the academic writing course, along with Cor Zonneveld, and I also am a literature professor, and I write about poetry and psychoanalysis, and also most recently Holocaust testimonies. But I'm not going to tell you anything about my work. We're here to talk about the work of Professor Laura Nawijn. Laura is a neuroscientist at the University of Amsterdam, and she's also a wonderful teacher here at AUC. And she's going to tell us a lot about her work, how she's done it, and how she thinks about writing in her field. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Dawn. Thanks for inviting me.
So great to have you.
I'm not a professor just yet, but
close enough.
We'll see.
So tell us a little bit about how you got into your field.
Yeah, so I'm doing neuroscience research now at the medical hospital here in Amsterdam. But I started out doing psychology as a student. I think I've always been interested in why people behave the way that they do. I think in a way it was maybe inspired by a friend of mine who also endured some difficulties in her youth. And I always wondered how these experiences also shape your personality, how they shape your behavior, and if we would have been different persons, if we would have had different experiences. So that was a reason for me to get into psychology. And there, neuroscience was kind of an emerging field at that time.
Were you at the UvA, Laura?
This was in Leiden. I started in Leiden University.
Okay. Yeah. Good to know. So then neuroscience was on the rise.
Yeah, they didn't have a neuroscience master yet. There weren't so many neuroscience masters. I was always, I think I've been also a bit genetically and also nurture affected by this, because my father is a GP and my mom was a psychologist. So at home we would always be discussing like health and behavior and analyzing these things. And I had a course in my first year about biological psychology. And just this whole idea really blew my mind, and I was completely fascinated by the brain. So then I moved to Amsterdam to do a bachelor in biological psychology there, which was one of the first in the country. And then I did a master in neuroscience.
And now you're finishing your PhD.
PhD is already finished.
Oh, okay. So I thought when you said I'm not a professor, but I think of a professor as someone who's finished her PhD, which you have.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So
yeah.
I'm
Yeah. I understand. It's the Dutch system that I'm not aware of as I could be. So will you tell us a little bit about your interest as a writer in neuroscience and your areas of research?
Yeah, so I did my PhD. Well, actually, I did a bit of a detour, I guess. After my master's, I worked at TNO. Do you know?
No, I don't.
Like a more applied sciences institute. Because when I was doing my master's, I kind of missed the applicability. I felt like sometimes you're looking at these tiny little details and how they affect tiny other little details. So this more holistic view of people was missing to me at that time, and how it could help society. So I worked for a few years there looking at interventions and in health interventions and how they might improve, for example, obesity in children.
Okay.
But there I noticed that I was really more interested in how things work and not if they work. So there we investigated these interventions. Do they work? Yes or no? But I wanted to know, like, how does this work? So I started missing the brain and the more fundamental science. So then I did my PhD at the AMC.
And tell us more about that.
So that was a neuroimaging study. So we really looked at brains, but also in a more applied way. So we investigated if the hormone oxytocin, which is also known as the cuddle hormone, if this might help people with post-traumatic stress disorder. So if it might reduce their anxiety, but also make them more susceptible to like social support in their environment. And I did this by doing brain scans. So by really checking if these processes in the brain would also be altered by this hormone.
Okay.
And now I'm working on neurobiology of depression and also PTSD still, to see what is, if we can understand what's going on in the brains of these people with these disorders. And hopefully that will help treat them as well.
And did you tell me that it's that part of your studies are about inflammation and depression, the inflamed brain? I remember you talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's a project I'm currently working on. So that was based also on some of my findings in my PhD, where I noticed that sometimes we can't lump all the patients together. So they might have PTSD, they all have the same diagnosis, but they're not all the same. So they show very different symptoms, but they also might show different biology. So that's also some of the things that I'm working on now, amongst which is inflammation research, is to see if people with depression, so people with depression can, for example, have symptoms of increased appetite, so eating more, but other patients show decreased appetite, so they eat less. So that's kind of strange, right? If you think about it, that they all have the same label or diagnosis, but they show very different behavior. So we're looking, do they also show differences in their biology? So is this increased appetite or decreased appetite? Is that related to differences in inflammation, which is one of the theories in my lab?
Great.
So yeah, and
that's really interesting.
Yeah, that might help also.
So now we know what you research, but we don't know how you write about it, what you do, how you represent it or account for it or tell it in research, or in writing rather. So tell us about that part, however you want to.
Yeah, so I thought about how a research idea was born. I think a lot of so if you do a study, you answer some questions that you were meant to answer in your research, but often they also lead to many more new questions or new ideas. So okay, we know this now, but maybe we can understand it better by looking at different processes. But also I get a lot of inspiration from talking to other scientists, talking to my colleagues, but also at conferences, or even Twitter, or reading the newspaper, which can help you think about other aspects that might be interesting, or tie these different factors together.
You also read things like articles from the library and stuff like that, or?
Yeah. So I keep up to date with recent literature in my field. So I have some search terms that I automatically get updates on. I don't know if I might show you.
That would be great.
How I do that.
I think one of the things we're thinking about now as we move into the research unit is, how do you find the sources? How do you look at all these different sources without spending your whole life, reading? And how do you make sense of the relationship between the sources and how they relate to your project? So these are big questions, but we thought that if you show us how you do it, that'll be a nice start for us.
Yeah, great. Let me share my screen. And I think in a way it starts out with an idea, then it gets completely messy when you try to read up on it and try to tie all these concepts together, and then slowly a more clear line will show up.
I've thought about this so much in my field, how sometimes it feels like, not like digesting the reading, but something like you're playing with these readings one by one and in relation to each other. And eventually you can actually say, oh, this one is doing this and this one is doing this, and here's how they relate to each other. But it's not immediate. It's like kind of, at first it feels like it's just sort of cacophony. There's so many voices at once. You have that experience as a scientist too, reading. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think at first I thought it would be more of a linear, organized process. But more and more I'm finding it's usually more a bit like this, right?
I was just, oh, go ahead, show us. Yeah. Please.
Yeah. So you see my browser window, right?
Great. Yep.
So I wanted to take you through an article I've already published, but I've looked at some phases looking back and to see how the writing sort of grew.
That's great.
So this was an idea that so it is actually based on a clinical problem. So from the clinic, we know that people with depression often also have high levels of anxiety. So this is, of course, affecting their quality of life. So it's important for people with these disorders or mental health problems. But also they show clinically like worse treatment outcomes. So it might be more difficult to treat people with depression that also have a comorbid anxiety. So that's a sort of a societal problem that was the basis of this research. So this was actually a collaboration with a pharmacology company, and they have found some new drugs that might target anxiety specifically, but they had only shown it in animals thus far. So they reached out to our department, who has a large database of people with anxiety and depression, and also brain scans of these people, to see if we can find more of the neurobiology, so what's going on in the brain in people with comorbid anxiety and depression. So that's a bit of the background. So then I usually start to read up on this. So I might do a quick search. So this is PubMed, which is a database that I use quite a lot, really aimed at biomedical research. There's also Google Scholar, which is also a big one. And I think different fields have their own libraries, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I might search for depression, anxiety, and brain.
So you just put all three words in, no quotes. That's it. And it'll, okay, there it is.
So this is sort of a quick browse, right? So I might also add review to see if there's already some overview studies, and just browse through these.
Now, when you're browsing, what are you looking for?
So here you see these keywords that I typed in. They get shown
Bolded. Yep.
in bolded. Yeah. So that already gives me a little bit of the idea of which of the keywords are in these topics. So I look at the titles. I scan the titles to see what's relevant, if they are relevant for me. So you see that
the first. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
So what I see is these first three are all about the microbiome or the gut-brain axis. This is not what I'm interested in. Although I guess I would note it in the back of my head, thinking like, oh, the microbiome, that's maybe kind of a big thing now. And there I see brain popping up, sex differences. Oh yeah, that's a relevant topic as well. Again, microbiome.
Now, what are you actually looking for? How do you know you don't want these things?
So I would want to see if there's a review on really brain depression and anxiety. So something that's already been published. Maybe that's not published yet. So this would be something that I would
Okay.
click on and then read the abstract and maybe download the article.
So if you read the abstract, that gives you a better sense of whether you want it or not, and then you download it if it sounds good.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I read the abstract. So circuits and mechanisms, that sounds to me like they did something with the brain, or neurobiological mechanisms, even though brain is not in the title. So then I scan this bit. Well, so they look at brain biology. So yeah, I would download this one.
Okay. And when you download it, do you immediately read it, or are you gathering first and then reading later?
Well, in my experience, when I download them and I don't read them immediately, they are left in a big pile somewhere on my computer. So I try to read it straight away. I don't read the whole thing. So there's maybe only 5% of the studies that I download, or the articles that I download, I read in much detail. So here I would scan for and maybe highlight some of the passages that are interesting to me or relevant to me.
Okay.
So that's just getting a lay of the land, what's already out there.
Excellent.
Now, if I'm really going to write, I would do a more advanced search. So this is really very detailed, and I want to make sure I don't miss any studies. So here, this database has an advanced search builder. So if I go back to this one. So here, if someone would be talking about major depressive disorder and not mention the word depression, I might miss it because it's written kind of differently. Or if they talk about anxious. So you want to make sure you don't miss any of those terms. So this is how I would build this horribly complex search term.
Wait, did you write that?
Sorry?
You wrote this?
So this is something that I created earlier.
Okay, okay. So this is how you get all of these, so you make sure you catch everything. And what I'm understanding now, Laura, is that as a scientist, you don't want to miss any studies of what you're talking about. That's part of your goal. Like if you're going to talk about this topic, you want to make sure that you cite those studies that have been done recently.
Yeah, so I guess especially if you would do like a systematic literature review or a meta-analysis, then you really, really don't want to miss out on anything that's out there. So that's when I would definitely do this really structured search term. And then also scan all the articles that have come out of that search term.
So it looks like you have 2,976 hits here. Is that right?
Yeah. So this was not for a systematic review.
Okay.
So I could have been a little less strict.
Okay.
But at least most of them should be in there. So you see indeed that with this sort of rough search, you get about half of the articles that you would if you have a more structured search term.
And when you have something like 1,600, what happens next? I mean, that's a lot of articles.
Yeah, so usually I scan maybe the first 4 pages, so the first 40 articles. And at some point you will notice that they will get less and less relevant. So they might miss out on some of the search terms. So that's when I stop reading onwards. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And this is for a publication, right? So you're not doing it for a random, thing. You're actually trying to publish something about this topic. And tell us more about your thinking about that, like what you're trying to do here. So you've done this, you've got these sources, and also you're in your mind, you're thinking about publishing, but there are pieces of this that I still don't quite understand. So tell us more about this.
Yeah, so when I'm starting to write, I usually go back to a research template that I once got in a scientific writing class during my PhD. Let's see if I can put that up.
Great. Maybe you'll even share it with us. Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this is a template made by Ed Hull, who gave scientific writing courses to PhD students. And I find myself going back and back to it because it's really helpful for me to build up and structure my writing. Yeah, so this is the template for a research article made by Ed Hull, who gave scientific writing courses for PhD students. And I really find myself going back and back to this template to help me structure my writing. So he said to first describe a big problem that needs to be solved. So then at first I make this sort of rough draft of my introduction. So I think about what is the big problem that needs to be solved, and I want to contribute to. So in this way, so depression is of course a horrible thing that needs to be solved. We cannot treat it well for everyone. Also, that anxiety is highly prevalent, and that the patients with high levels of anxiety, they have a worse treatment outcome. So we need to improve treatment. So that's kind of the shaping the societal field that I'm working on. So a big problem needs to be solved. Then state your specific strategy to help solve the problem. So I wrote here sort of a solution that might help contribute to this problem is to help understand the neurobiology. This might help to improve treatment, for example, designing new drugs. And then that kind of funnels you to the writing down the research question of your article and how that might help solve the problem. So this is the research problem that I wanted to investigate. The research question. So do major depressive disorder patients with and without anxiety show differences in specific regions of the brain and how they function? So then I have this sort of rough layout of what I want to say in my introduction.
And how long did it take you to get to this moment where you knew this is what you're doing here in this paper? Like, you want to explore this. Is this like a months-long process or something that you've been working on always? I can't quite understand the relationship between your library searching and this moment where you're ready to write this piece, these 750 words.
Yeah, so they kind of go in parallel. So this project was already written up, so to say, by my department head and the pharmacological company. So they had a rough idea of what they wanted to do. And I was allowed to work on this project and really look at the data. So usually when I start writing this bit, I've already done data analyses.
Okay.
I've already have an idea of the research question and already know the answers to the research question.
Okay.
But once I start writing the official part, that's when I put all of this down.
Okay.
Though of course in head sort of the rough outline is already in the grant proposal and before you start doing your research.
Okay. This is going to be your contribution now, or at least one of your contributions.
Yeah. So I guess in different versions, like a project proposal, already parts of this have been discussed, and it's shaped more and more once you get to the stage of really writing your article.
Okay.
I don't know if this is big enough for you to read, actually.
Yes, I think we can see it, actually. Yeah.
Well, I guess you don't really need to like read all the
Well,
details.
it's helpful to see this. It would be wonderful to have the handout that you like so much, that sheet about how to do this, if you're willing to share it. I don't know if it's something you can share. But also we will be stopping this in class to take a closer look. So it's great to have it this size so that we can look at it together.
Yeah, so here I take this, how do you call it? Like a skeleton or a build-up of the introduction. And I start filling in the paragraphs. So I usually start out with what I want to say in a paragraph in one sentence. So this is the message that I want to convey in this paragraph. So anxiety and depression is common and it's clinically relevant. So going back to this societal problem, and I start to fill it in. So for example, here I mentioned that anxiety and comorbid anxiety disorders are very prevalent in individuals with major depressive disorder. So that's a statement. And then I back it up with data or other findings.
So is this one of those articles that you read? Okay.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
what style are you using? we use APA or MLA. What is this called?
In this phase, it's just what's practical for me. So the first
Okay.
author and the date.
Okay, that looks
so
like
I-
APA to us.
Yeah.
Okay.
But like here, for example, here it still says refs, so I still need to put in the
okay.
precise references. So this is
Okay.
really in a draft version.
Great.
And sometimes I will make a statement or want to make a statement, and then I will look specifically for literature that can back up that statement. And I think that is something that can take up a lot of time in science writing, because basically every statement that you make, you need to back it up either with other references showing it when it's about the introduction, or with data, and that's in the discussion more.
So keep going with this paragraph if you don't mind. It's helpful to us, I think, to see the whole thing.
Okay.
So like,
Yes.
what does this mean, stable subtype?
You see that?
Well, after the blue. Why is that blue?
Oh, I highlighted it because I thought it might be the parts that I wanted to show.
Okay.
Right here, I emphasize the clinical relevance.
What is the clinical relevance? Just tell us about that.
So that anxious depression, so depression in combination with anxiety, has worse treatment outcomes. They have a more chronic course, also increased risk of suicidality. So this makes it relevant to investigators.
Oh, this is what we call motive, which is like, why does this matter? This matters a lot because of what you just, okay, okay, good.
So if anxiety and depression would all be easily treatable, there wouldn't be a problem, right? So
Okay.
that's why it's important.
Okay. Then you say stable subtype. What does that mean?
Oh, not sure if I remember that.
Oh, okay. Okay. That's okay. Okay. No
So
problem.
yeah, I just put in these thoughts. Also, I often have these versions in a Google Doc or an online thing, so that whenever I have a thought at a random moment, I can just quickly type it in wherever I am.
Oh, okay. Okay. Nice.
Or if I come across a reference while I'm doing something else that might be interesting, I can quickly browse like which paragraph should this go in and just put it in there.
Nice. And what is the function of this next part based on the clinical relevance of anxiety and depression, et cetera, et cetera? What is that sentence for? Do you know?
Yeah, so the DSM-5, which is sort of a clinical handbook of psychiatric disorders. This is the newest version because it recognized the clinical relevance of anxiety and depression. They made a new specifier, so to say. So in this handbook of psychiatric disorders, you know, have this paragraph about major depressive disorder, all the symptoms that psychiatrists or psychologists use to get a diagnosis. But you also have these subtypes. So for example, the anxious distress specifier was then devised. So people that don't formally have an anxiety disorder, such as panic disorder or phobia, but they do show high levels of anxiety. The psychiatrist can sort of make a note of that and check symptoms for this.
Okay.
And sometimes those are related to different treatment strategies.
Okay. So where is the part where you are like, what is your intervention here? Like what you're bringing to the table? So you're talking about what the problem is and what people have contributed to thinking about the problem. And where is it where you say, here's what I'm doing? Or is that not part of writing in science?
Yeah, of course. So I kind of channel the idea towards this neurobiological aspect. So saying that neurobiology might help improve treatment by getting new treatment targets or help understand how the brain works, which can help pharmaceutical companies to try to intervene in these processes. So here I start to talk about how people with anxious depression might have different neurobiological profiles relative to depression without anxiety. So I discuss other studies that have looked at this. So for example, people have looked at differences in the immune system or in the shape of the brain.
So how did you get to the point where you were, this seems like such a wonderful sort of distillation of a lot of the reading that you did and putting it into different categories. Did that take a while to do that? Is that part of what we were talking about at the beginning, or?
Yeah, I guess, so you do I guess you do these quick searches or these overview searches to also get a feel of what is out there and to shape your ideas. Then you start writing these paragraphs with what you want to say, and you write down a certain statement. And then you often go back to the literature and see, is this statement true? I mean, you can make a statement that anxiety is very highly prevalent, but you have to find out if this is really the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or my hypothesis was that the amygdala, which is a brain region relevant for anxiety and fear, is more active in people with depression and anxiety compared to people with only depression. So I start to specifically look for that literature to back that statement or hypothesis up. And that can take a while. I guess it depends also. I usually have several projects going on, so these projects kind of go on and off. And these paragraphs also change over the course of writing.
What do you mean by that?
So I usually start making these real long paragraphs where I just write everything down that I can think of or that I find that's interesting. But usually you want your writing also to be to the point. And I think that's also maybe more specific to science literature.
Yeah.
Are very limited to your word count.
I think this is true in all fields, though. You write a lot and then you get rid of like half of it or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's also, I think you're also saying it's a process of distilling your thinking. Like it makes more sense to you, so you can get rid of the things that you don't need and you can say it a little more quickly. Yeah,
or you think like, oh, this is interesting when you put it in and you notice that it's sort of a side road that maybe distracts more from the story than that it adds. So you cut those things out.
Well, that's interesting. You're telling a story. You think of yourself as telling a story.
Yeah.
So you're telling a story about depression and anxiety versus just depression, and how the brain reflects some differences in people with depression and anxiety versus just depression.
Yeah.
That's so far, right? Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And also, so once I would have this version finished, I would invite my co-authors or colleagues that are also working on this project with me to read it. And of course, that also helps to kind of get that structure clear and see what can be cut out.
Okay.
Or just leaving it for a week and then come back to it and read it again.
I think that's where procrastination is the biggest devil of them all, because if you had a deadline of, tomorrow and you have to finish this, then it's clearly going to limit your ability to make it as good as if you have a month, for example, or a year. So,
yeah, I guess, although sometimes a deadline can also really help to make choices, right?
Yes. Yep. Good point.
And sometimes I think when you think about it, you usually know what needs to be taken out. So it's often that I found this study is just really fascinating and I want to describe them, but I know they're maybe not the best.
Oh, okay.
For the story.
Okay. Now, I was asking you earlier about where your intervention is, yeah. Okay.
So this is all writing about what other people have done in this field and what they found. So this is a lot of neurobiological terminology, but some found like increased connectivity between these and those brain regions, blah, blah, blah. And then you kind of get to this hypothesis. So,
and this is the research gap. We've arrived at the research gap. Is that right?
yeah.
Okay. So you've sorted through a whole lot of people talking about this in various ways and studying it and then talking about it. And now you have found a place where there's a gap and you're going to talk about that. You're going to explore that. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I was mainly interested in this anxious distress specifier that is new in the most recent manual of the psychiatry handbook, so to say. So I noticed that in literature, often researchers looked at a formal diagnosis of an anxiety disorder. So depression with phobia, depression with panic disorder. But that kind of skips the people with depression that have more general high levels of anxiety, but they don't have a formal diagnosis of a disorder, which is still a big group. And that has been under research, so to say. So that's the research gap. We don't know a lot about this people with this anxious distress specifier, or and then I form a hypothesis. So that process in the amygdala is possibly something that is different in people with depression and high levels of anxiety. And that it might be relevant for pharmacological modulation, so improving therapy in the future.
And why is that twin study there?
That shows so twin studies are often done to look at genetic components.
Mm-hmm.
So by comparing twins that are genetically identical, so monozygotic twins, relative to twins that are only for 50% genetically identical.
Okay.
I think I took this out in the end.
I was wondering if it ended up in the final. I mean, I can understand how you got there or what it's doing there now, but I was thinking, in the final draft, which I'm sure you'll show us, then it's probably a little different.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is also with I really am interested in genetic parts of these things. I think in the final manuscript, I took all the genetics out, but.
And is that something that you'll pursue in a different paper?
I might, yeah. So that could be basis for something new.
Okay.
And then I come to my research question. So what we'll look at, stating the variables and their relationships. So this is a statement from the template.
Yep.
So in the current study, we investigated if anxious distress in major depressive disorder was associated with specific neuroreactivity and connectivity patterns compared to depression patients without anxious distress and healthy controls.
Okay. And then you're interested in the amygdala responses. Okay.
Yeah, and there I put my hypothesis.
Okay. And then you start talking about how you did it, what you used.
Yeah.
Okay. This part where you got up to here. So would you say that this going through the literature and classifying it is a time-consuming process? Is it difficult for you, or how do you describe it? You've been doing it a lot. Does it get easier? How does it work for you? Because I know sometimes when people are first starting to do it, like an AWS class, it can feel really overwhelming that there's all this stuff out there and they don't know what to do with it all.
Yeah, it does get easier. I think also once you're in a field for longer, it's easier to put studies in perspective, I think. And also you learn your own personal tricks that work for you to get through it. I think this first phase, where you really have to make sense of all that literature that is out there. It takes time, although in a way I think I've accepted that, and I just start writing. For me, it's easier to edit and find a line, like the red line through my manuscript once I've written lots of things down. And then I will also see, like, okay, these parts need to be taken out. For that, I don't need to find any references because it's irrelevant. So I think it does get easier with time.
Do you have
also reading other people's work?
Reading other people's work. Okay. How does that help? Why does that help?
Yeah, I think in a while you will find that you'll start to recognize when things work or don't work, or really to connect parts of your manuscript together, like how the topics should be connected to each other. Yeah, I don't know, maybe more of an implicit process.
Yeah. I can see this. I mean, there are all these studies, which I'm sure you know a lot more about than I do, of people learning, like becoming better tennis players, for example, by watching other tennis players doing it either correctly or incorrectly. If they're very good, I think if they're not so good, it's not so helpful for a pro, but they can see people doing it and say, oh, right, they're not, bending their knees enough or whatever. Do you have a final copy of that article to show us?
Yes.
Or did I interrupt you showing us the draft? Do you want to show us any more of that draft? I really appreciate how you're taking us through this sort of relatively painstaking process of the making of an article. Oh, this is it. It looks beautiful. Oh my goodness. And it was published in a journal called Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Is that right?
Yeah, the journal's called Depression and Anxiety.
Okay.
So I think that already shows the topic of the journal, which is a journal by this Association of Anxiety and Depression.
Okay. And there's the title. Did you come up with the title immediately or did it come later?
No, I think I came up with it rather early, although it changed a bit.
The emotional faces is something I don't recognize from what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so I looked at reactivity of the amygdala, so that region, by looking at emotional faces. So emotional faces are very, like, evolutionary important for humans, as they give a lot of indication of the safety of a situation. So if everybody will start looking fearful or angry, people will notice immediately, right? So this is highly salient for humans, and the amygdala responds to these faces very strongly. So by showing people in the scanner happy faces, angry faces, fearful faces, will make your amygdala hyperactive. So this is a paradigm that is used to investigate amygdala activity. Okay.
And the abstract methods, results, conclusions, keywords, when did you write that in the process? Is that late in the game?
No, I actually often start out with this.
Okay.
At least once I've done my analyses and I know what the outcomes are, I often start writing an abstract. So in a way, that fits also with this skeleton of what the article is.
Okay.
And it will give me an idea of what the important findings are. So you're very limited in an abstract. They're supposedly maximum 250 or 300 words. So it forces you to think about what is important and which things I need to leave out.
Oh.
So I've done a lot of analyses for this study. So many of those will not end up in this results section.
Okay.
So this forces me to decide what is most important.
Okay. And the conclusions, that's what we were talking about earlier, is where you have entered the conversation, what you have discovered.
Yeah. And also trying to relate that back to this big societal problem.
Okay. Okay. And how did you choose your keywords? I guess that's obvious. You know what the major things that you're studying are, and you put them in here.
Yeah, that's usually not very difficult.
How long, what was the process of publication? Did you send it to the journal and then they said, we want it, and that was the end of that?
I think it might actually be in here. So this is peer reviewed. Oh no.
How do you know it's peer reviewed?
Actually, I think pretty much all of the respected scientific journals are peer
Yep.
reviewed.
Yeah.
So you
Yep.
send it in, it's sent out to other scientists in my field. They read it, they comment on it, send it back. So I think I had 2 revision rounds here. So the first 2 reviewers would ask questions. Like, can you elaborate on this? Or I don't agree with the method they used. Or this isn't clear to me. Then I change or revise, send it in. They check if they are happy. If they're not, they can ask some more questions. I think that took like half a year, maybe 9 months. Can take a while.
Yeah, yeah. If they don't like your methods, how can you change that?
If they don't like any of the methods, then you usually have to find a new journal that does like the methods. Sometimes, or it might also reconsider, like if you agree with them and their argumentation, you might redo the methods,
Okay.
redo your analyses. Usually the comments are not so big, that they might say like, oh, have you thought about the effects of gender? Do an additional analysis checking if this is explained by gender.
And then what do you do in that case?
Then you would run that analysis.
Oh, you would? Oh,
if
okay.
it's feasible.
Okay.
And it kind of sort of makes an addition to the paper.
And when you say run, are you looking at MRI results? Is that right? Are you looking at images of the brain? Is that what you're studying? And then you would look at gender in relation to these images?
Yeah.
Sort it out. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Helpful.
Yeah. So sometimes you have to do some additional statistical analyses.
And all correspondence for this article goes to you, and you're the lead author. Did these other people write part of the article? Like, what was their role in the writing process?
It differs a bit per article. So in this case, I wrote the whole draft, sent it out to the authors, co-authors. They all commented on it. Then I adjusted the paper, checked if they agreed, and if they agreed, I sent it out to the journal.
Okay. Can you show us the whole thing while we're in it, just so we can see what it looks like? There's the introduction. So many citations, so many.
Yes.
Now, do you keep track?
Science, like you have to back everything up. You cannot just make a statement.
Do you use some sort of citation organizing system? Like, you don't have them all in a Google Doc, I would imagine. How do you organize the reading that you do into categories, et cetera? On your
I have a citation manager.
Okay. What's it called? Do you know?
Zotero.
Okay, great.
So I already use that in when I'm searching for articles. So I have a Chrome extension. So if I find a relevant article, I immediately click on that button and it will automatically upload the reference in my citation manager.
Excellent. Okay, so then you have them there, and it's when you're pulling them up to use in a paragraph that's got like 100 references, it's easier to manage, I would imagine, than some people's systems that I know about a little too well. So the introduction is there, and you have something yellowed, right?
Yeah. So I think this kind of relates back to what I already shown. Like
yes. Okay.
Yeah. So I often start paragraphs or I end them with the conclusion.
Okay, very important to know.
And then in the middle parts of the paragraph, I sort of back it up with more detailed findings.
It looks beautiful.
Let me see. So yeah, here
so clear. I mean, you know, I'm a person from another field, and as I read it, I think, oh, I understand this. And it's not, I mean, like on the basic level, let's not exaggerate, but yeah.
So I think this is a relevant statement. So this is the end of a paragraph, which kind of sort of is my conclusion of that paragraph. what I want people to take home from this paragraph. So a more clearly delineated neurobiological profile of anxious depression may inform us on the underlying mechanisms of the worst clinical prognosis observed related to that anxiety specifier, and ultimately aid to the treatment.
Yeah. I like how you say disentangle heterogeneity. That's such a nice verb, disentangle, and it makes heterogeneity. There are a couple of classes studying metaphors, and this seems like a classic example of this idea of heterogeneity actually being a tangle. Like it seems like, oh, everybody's like this, but your word disentangle, your verb, makes it clear that what looks like everything is actually a big mess of stuff that needs to be disentangled. I like that a lot.
I guess it is a good metaphor.
It's also so clear. And then you have your methods section.
Yeah, that's usually pretty dry. It's like how many people, how old were they, which measures did I use? So I use this composite international diagnostic interview to label the diagnosis of depression. How were they scanned? How did I run my analyses? So this, yeah.
Okay, and then your results.
Blah, blah, blah.
Oh, you have a chart. This is often the case in science writing, I understand.
Sorry, there?
In the humanities, we don't have a lot of charts in our articles, for the most part.
I think this is a chart that is always in a primary research article, so it's not very legible, but this is the sample characteristics. So I state how many females and males were in the sample, what was their age, were they smoking, education, but also like clinical characteristics. So what age were they when the depression started? Also, how high were their levels of anxiety? How high were their levels of depression? So this helps the readers to see what kind of sample this was. For example, if you're investigating depression in females, you might be interested to see how many females were in my sample.
Oh, I see. Well, that was my question, because students are doing literature reviews. So if they read an article like this, what I would imagine is it would be useful for them to read the first couple of pages. And for their literature review, it's most of the articles they read, they won't need to read down to the end to understand what they need to understand to place it in their literature review. Do you agree with that? Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. So like the method section and like these really detailed results sections, I only read for a very low percentage of articles. Only when I'm really wanting to check something specifically.
Okay.
Like for example, if an article describes a finding that completely does not align with what I found, I want to check like, oh, were there like large differences between my study or their study? Were they all men? Were they all like adolescents? I don't know. For finding explanations for maybe inconsistencies, for example. But usually I read the abstract, the first and last paragraph of the introduction. I look at the figures in the results section, and the last paragraph of the discussion. That is what I usually read.
That's what you read. Excellent. Really helpful. Oh, nice. Charts, diagrams.
Yeah, so I'm a very visual person, so I usually look at the figures more than the text in the results section, as they show me, or at least to me, what the differences are. So this is one of my main findings, is that the amygdala was more active in people with anxious depression. Okay.
And would that mean, would that explain, for example, eating more or less, or not related? Or is that a good next question?
No, in this study, I didn't look at
I mentioned that earlier.
No.
Yeah. But if you wanted to do that, would that be a logical next step to go in that direction, or not really, I guess?
Yeah, it could be. So for other studies, that's also like you find something yourself, you read other people's work, so that makes you think like, oh, maybe they're combined. how they're related, or
Okay. So the first, the A is the depression and anxiety with the amygdala very active. Is that right? And B is just,
yeah, so this is another region that we found.
oh, okay.
I didn't have any hypothesis on this region,
Okay. Oh, I
but
see.
it also showed a difference,
Oh, okay.
so I put it in.
Okay.
And that
Interesting.
can also be an idea for new research.
And what is that part of the brain in charge of? Or,
So this is the putamen, which is important for example, reward processing.
oh, okay. Interesting. Huh. That's very interesting. So it's more active in someone who's anxious and depressed, according to your studies?
Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah.
that's cool. I mean, I associate to schizophrenia where people have a sort of word salad. You know, they produce so many words sometimes, and I was just, as a non-scientist, kind of curious, like, oh, is this related? Could I study this? Or could someone study that? Or has someone studied that? Probably completely unrelated, but what do we have down here?
So yeah, and there I also put it in words, of course,
Uh-huh.
what I'm showing in
What-
pictures.
Oh,
and,
is that right? You explain what you see there. Okay. So the little words, what's the difference between those little words under the drawing, you know, under the image, and then the paragraphs, like the figure one, it looks like that. Oh, when you say I put it in words, that's what you mean. Is that correct?
So in these paragraphs, I described my analyses and what came out of them.
Okay.
Under the figure, I also describe what is shown in the figure. So the figure should be understandable without the text. So I basically copy a part of the text here as well.
Okay. Great.
And
then do you have, oh, go
what
ahead.
these different groups denote, those kind of things are also explained. Another finding, I guess I won't go into that now.
Okay.
And then we get to the discussion.
And how do you think about what the discussion does? What
So here I also follow that template.
okay.
So usually in the first paragraph, I describe sort of a summary of the findings. I repeat the research question and the answers that my study gave to it. And then I move per paragraph onto a more detailed description. So I repeat my finding, but I also put it in perspective. So how does that relate to what other people already shown? Does it compare, or is it very unlike what other people have found? Possible explanations. So also taking a more theoretical perspective. So how does this fit in with our understanding of depression or our understanding of the brain? So in these paragraphs, I show, for example, I discuss this amygdala hyperreactivity. In this paragraph, I discuss another finding that I looked at, but that we didn't discuss yet, so I won't go into that. I also have a specific paragraph on limitations and strengths, which I think is relevant. So if people are looking for a quick grasp of what were problems in my study. So for example, we only included a small amount of people, so we don't know how this generalizes, or those kind of things we can describe here. And actually many journals also ask you to put this paragraph in my study. And a paragraph on clinical implications. So it's basically, so you find these things that are different in the brain, but what does that mean for a patient? What does that mean for a psychiatrist? So kind of moving back to that big societal problem.
It's so helpful to have you walk us through this. I really think people are going to find it easier to read science papers now that you're showing us how this one got made. I wonder, did you want to say more about what's in front of us now, Laura?
Yeah, I don't know how much time we have left.
We can spend a little more time together because people have 2 hours to discuss this lecture, so it's lots of time.
Yeah, so a clinical implications paragraph is not always in a manuscript, but I think it's very important to discuss. I also like to put it in with a specific header so people can find it easily. But sometimes it's more just part of the big discussion. But I think you should really relate back to how this is helping society, right? So I repeat that statement that a better understanding of the neurobiology of anxious depression is relevant. So that's basically something that I said before. I repeat my finding. So amygdala is hyperactive. So it may be a promising target specifically for people with anxious depression. So a target for treatment. And then I look for maybe new treatments that are already out there that might help this amygdala to dampen a bit, right? So there's new studies showing neurofeedback, which is when people are in a scanner or they have like an EEG cap that is measuring their brain activity, that gives them feedback on the activity of their amygdala. So while they're in a scanner or they're looking at these emotional faces, for example, they get feedback whether their amygdala is very active, yes or no. And this is a new intervention that allows people to try and directly reduce their amygdala activity, which I think is completely
That's really fascinating. By like meditation kind of, or bio, it's like, I guess it's biofeedback.
It's biofeedback, yes. Yeah,
that's fascinating. So on the one hand, right when I was listening to you, I first thought, oh, well, this is for drug companies, and then they're going to have a drug that affects the amygdala to sort of calm it down in the anxious person, and that will help. Or the oxytocin that you talked about earlier, they'll get loving feelings, and that will help the amygdala be less stressed. And now I see from hearing you and reading that actually biofeedback is a possibility as well. So this is really fascinating. I think there will end up being some people in AWS who want to study something related to this in their literature review, simply because it's so interesting.
Yeah, and I think often biology is seen as something that is also maybe away from psychotherapy, right? But we also know that psychotherapy helps these biological processes. So also by doing psychotherapy, after, I don't know, 6 sessions or so, people can have less amygdala reactivity and also have less feelings of anxiety. So these things are all connected, they're just at different levels.
That's really fascinating too. Now, Laura, was there more that you wanted to tell us about that you planned for here?
Oh, I guess, yeah, so these are also bits. So yeah, here I see that these psychotherapy interventions might also help to dampen reactivity, but also pharmacology.
Yes, I see, yeah.
And what future studies might be doing. And then I guess the conclusion paragraph is basically a reiteration and linking it back to that societal problem.
Wonderful. It's really helpful to see this. I wonder, before we finish, this is so generous of you to open this up for us. I think it's been really helpful. I just wondered if you could talk, sometimes even when you go through the details as you have, it can seem so easy, right? Like it seems like you know what you want to do, you know what you think about it, you're looking at what other people have done, you write it up. Yes, it's messy, it takes some time. Are there times when you've felt frustrated, or that you might even consider like failures as a writer or researcher, that you would be willing to talk about? I mean, even one, like moments of frustration or confusion, or when things take a lot longer than you want them to, or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for some people are natural writers. So it seems to, this flow of writing seems to come easily, and whatever they write is just this beautiful piece. For others like me, it's more of a more difficult process maybe. So I really need to take a big chunk of time, and in the beginning I might feel hesitant or I don't want to start, but once I start, it helps. So I try to block like a whole day for writing. I might not be efficient the whole day, but otherwise, for me, writing is not something that you can do in an hour, right? So you need to have this headspace to be writing. In terms of failures, I don't know. I don't think they're necessarily failures, but you learn with everything you do. So the writing of this article might change throughout the process. To me, that doesn't feel like a failure, but it's just sometimes you cannot know everything up front, or at least I can't.
Well, that's kind of what science is about, right? And what writing is about, discovering things as you go, I guess. I think you've also shown us how important reading is to the process, how much you do, how much reading you do as a scientist to write up your results, to think about what to do next. It seems like reading is a very important part of your work. Is that right?
Yeah, maybe scanning is a better word.
Scanning. Yeah.
I do a lot
Okay.
of scanning of articles.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
so helpful.
yeah.
That's so helpful. Well, I just want to thank you for joining us. We've taken over an hour of your time. It's been really wonderful being together and hearing your thoughts about this. And thank you. It's just a great gift to us as a group.
I hope it was helpful.
Very helpful. Thanks so much.